For me, sculpture was never a hobby. Sculpture was something integral to life. Sculpture was life, as a matter of fact. I don't hang my skirts. I don't drape my skirts. I slap my bronze with my silk. That's altogether different. I started at 7 years old. I never stopped. My grandmother was convinced that I was a genius, and she was determined this little protege that she had invented was going to make a mark in the art world. I needed ballet lessons, not because I was going to be a dancer, but because, I had to walk correctly, this kind of thing. She was the first sculptor. She was the one sculpting me into what I was supposed to be. I didn't know that I would be the first female acquisition in the MoMA collection at 15. I thought this was normal, that this was what happened to people in life. And so I went to the Tyler School of Fine Arts, where I did undergraduate work. And I was awarded a John Hay Whitney Fellowship. And the fellowship was just too much for such a young girl. So they decided that it should be to the American Academy in Rome. My mother wasn't convinced. My grandmother wasn't convinced. My father wasn't convinced. And these two men, Sabatini and Boris Bly, convinced them that I had the right to expand myself into something that was transatlantic, to take the boat, take the French liner, which is what I did, with all kinds of expectations, but with no real expectations. Adam and Eve was the first major sculpture of my life. I was enthralled. It was the first time I had a foundry where I could make something of that size. It was first worked in plaster and then made into a lost wax. The foundry, of course, introduced me to all kinds of possibilities. This is where I discovered the real technique of lost wax without the core and without the plaster, which I began to push further and further into the most violent configurations until I began my family, which began in '64. And this was a dramatic break until '67, '68. When I finally went back to work, I discovered that a whole revolution had taken place, not only politically in my head, but also aesthetically. My sculpture, which had been surrealistic, had suddenly crossed the boundary into abstraction. And so the top of the sculpture was abstract, and then there were these legs approaching me because they always went back to the idea of Giacometti's figure, and so they all had legs. And so I had this problem, and I knew that at that moment I had to get the sculpture off the floor, off the base, and I had to hide the legs. As soon as I attached the cords that hid the armature, magic happened. There was a transfer of power from the fiber and, let's say, the weak materiality to the bronze. At that point, I thought I could do anything. And then Malcolm came. I was shattered by the assassination of Malcolm X. And these cells were the way of manifesting his power, his presence. I was not making portraitures, and I certainly wasn't making political statements about Malcolm. I was making memoriam. I was making a monument to the idea of Malcolm, and this is a very Chinese idea. The fact is, when China was closed to Americans in 1965, I was invited especially by the Minister of Culture, which made me the first American woman to visit China after their revolution. The origin of the Cleopatra series involves another trip of Marc Riboud to China in the 70s, where he photographed the famous hand shrouds, and he wrote me a letter describing these objects. And from his letter, I began the first Cleopatra. Not lost wax, but sand casting. The flax are sewn together, and in the cape, there are 3,947, if you like that kind of thing. Cleopatra's wedding dress is the last Cleopatra, and she is the symbol of modernity as far as the power of women are concerned. So from the Cleopatra, we can go to the Josephine Baker series. Josephine was the epitome of movement, of jazz. The reason why I wanted to do Josephine was because it's a leap into space. The verticality of the Malcolms has been pulled off the chords into space. That's Josephine. That's rhythm, that's jazz, that's futurism, the depiction of movement. It is the end of the musical series and probably the end of me. It is the way I'm going out. I'm going out through the door of futurism because that's where the action is. Let's leave it at that.